Whispers of the Unseen, Episode 8 Voices of the Unseen. Translated by Lamu, produced by Zatta. Part 1. The forest had always been more than a shelter. It was a living body, a breathing cathedral whose pillars were trees and whose hymns were carried by the wind. Each dawn, shafts of light would slide between the canopy, touching the soil like blessings, awakening moss and ferns to shimmer with dew. Streams wound through the valleys with the patience of ancient storytellers, whispering tales into every stone they caressed. The cries of birds stitched the sky together, while the rhythm of our paws pressed patterns into the earth, a script written and rewritten by generations before me. Within this realm, I was not merely a creature of flesh. I was resonance, one voice in the vast choir of mountain and wind. My kin shared this truth. Our breath was part of the currents that moved between peaks, our hearts beating in synchrony with the rains and roots. Here, we were not prey, not trophies, not shadows. We were a people of the unseen, guardians of a harmony older than memory. But sanctuaries are fragile things. They endure storms, they survive droughts, yet they falter when eyes of hunger fix upon them. The first sign was silence. The birds abandoned their perches, their songs swallowed by an invisible weight. Insects ceased their humming, their tiny orchestras falling mute. Even the wind hesitated, moving slower, burdened by the scent of smoke that clung to fur and bark. From far below, in places where the forest thinned and met the soil of men, came the unfamiliar cadence of tools, the clatter of metal, the thump of wood struck by human hands. Then came the fire. At first it was timid, a flicker hidden beneath leaves, but soon it grew teeth, climbing trunks and licking sky, spitting embers like venom. Smoke rolled thick, heavy with strange powders that stung eyes and dulled senses. It was not the honest fire of lightning or ritual. It was engineered, controlled, bent to serve. We gathered at the cavern mouth, uneasy in a way our bodies had never known. The eldest still wore defiance into the night, yet the timbre of his voice wavered, a tremor born not from cowardice, but from wounds that refused to close. His flanks glistened where steel had kissed him, blood drying in streaks that even the cold river could not cleanse. Mothers pressed their forms around the young, shielding fragile bodies with muscle and bone, their eyes sharp and restless. We had always stood together against storm and predator, but this was different. This was not nature's test. It was an intrusion that belonged to neither sky nor soil. They came with traps that mocked the forest's own cunning. Nets not woven from vine but from iron threads, resistant to tooth and claw, unyielding even to the strongest surge. Hooks hidden in earth and leaf, cruel fangs that tore into flesh and refused to let go. Fire whose smoke carried strange scents that clouded thought, smothered will, and wrapped the mind in a haze of weakness. And always, behind the frenzy of torches, behind the cries of hunters, there was one gaze. Calm, measured, as if I were already marked. I remember the night when 2 of our young were lost. Their cries split the canopy, thin and desperate, when their limbs were caught in the hidden jaws of human craft. We surged to their aid, paws pounding earth, yet flames burst to life around us, forming a ring of searing orange. Torches thrust forward, revealing faces not twisted with hunger, but curved with satisfaction. Their eyes glittered with the thrill of conquest, not necessity. I hurled myself forward, claws tearing into the chest of one who dared stand before me. His cry was swallowed by the roar of fire. For an instant I thought we had won, that blood repaid blood. But the victory was an illusion. No sooner had my claws withdrawn than a net dropped from above. Weighted with iron, it crashed onto my back, dragging me down. Fibers bit into skin, slicing as they tightened. I thrashed, but the more I fought, the deeper they cut, until the earth beneath me slicked with my own blood. Struggling, I lifted my head and met his eyes. Not the wide, frantic eyes of hunters desperate for food. Not the wild glimmer of those who fight for survival. His gaze was steady, unblinking, precise, like a craftsman examining material. To him, I was not life. I was not kin. I was not a voice in the choir of wind and stone. I was already a commodity. The witch wants to tell you, when a soul is reduced to usefulness, when its worth is measured only in what it can provide, it no longer matters whether it can roar or whisper. What matters is only how it can serve. But ask yourself this: if the protection you wear on your chest, or bow before on an altar, is built upon the suffocation of another's freedom, is it truly protection, or another chain you have chosen to bind yourself with? Because chains are not always iron. Sometimes they are carved from faith twisted into possession, from prayers offered not with love, but with greed. And every time you kneel before a captured soul and call it divine, you risk forgetting the most sacred truth, that divinity never thrives in cages. Part 2. The night of fire did not end when the flames sank back into their beds of ash. It lived on as a taste and a weight and a memory that refused to be washed from fur or throat. It drifted in gray veils through the hollows where we hid. It clung to whiskers and eyelids and the small places between claws where sap and soil usually slept, and it made our breathing sound like strangers had moved into our lungs. We pulled ourselves into the mountain's narrow veins, into fissures we had always thought belonged to bats and winter water, and the stone pressed its cold against our ribs as if it too were listening for pursuit. The young shivered without sound, learning in one night the discipline that seasons should have taught gently across years. Mothers curved their bodies into walls, their chests rising shallow and slow so the air would not betray us, and when a pebble skittered down somewhere deeper in the dark, 100 ears tilted together like leaves turning to a late wind. Outside, the forest spoke a new grammar. Paths that once behaved like memory now behaved like snares. Clearings that once collected moonlight now collected the white dust of human powder. The river that had always served as our ally, masking scent, swallowing prints, was choked with a film that turned its speech thick and untrustworthy. The elder stood at the last of our line, shoulders still wide even as pain made his steps uneven. And though he had always taught with roar and iron glance, he taught us now by example, by the way he refused to rush the injured, by the way he stopped to let each small body pass through a crack before him as if his bones were the gate and his breath the hinge. And I watched the scars on his flanks shine wet in the poor light, and I understood that guardianship could look like retreat when retreat meant the young would live to greet another dawn. We waited until the night thinned to indigo, that hour when birds consider singing but prudence says wait, and then we moved, a slow river of fur and muscle threading from one shadow to the next. The plan was simple and therefore holy. Mothers and children first, those with torn flesh next, the strongest last to erase and confuse what our passing might reveal. The wind seemed to cooperate, turning its face so our scent slid downhill in a useless direction, and for a stretch of time the mountain placed stones exactly where paws needed them, and there was hope the way a match holds heat before it is struck. It is a cruelty of survival that hope often appears just before the world shows you its next wound. We reached a ridge we had crossed 100 seasons without incident, an open, bony place where lichens held the rock like old stories, and as the first of us laid weight upon it, the ground answered not with firmness, but with a sound like teeth snapping shut. From beneath the brush rose a lattice of sharpened stakes, hinged to leap when invited, and they sprang up into a rude wall that split our river down its center. On either side, fire lifted from bowls hidden beneath loose stones, fed by powders that hissed as if breathing for their keepers, and the smoke rolled not wild but disciplined, trained to crawl low and taste the ground where paws must fall. The forest tried to help. I felt it in the way a gust bent the angle of a flame just long enough for a mother and her two to slip past a jut of stone, in the way a stick broke under a man's boot to make him glance the wrong way. But men had choreographed this moment, measured the breath between our choices, and they poured from 3 directions carrying the false suns of their torches, and their voices knitted together into something like a song, a hard, proud rhythm that told each of them where the others were and told us nothing we could use. The elder went forward as if he had no wounds at all, and when a stake's point sought his shoulder, he turned so it found only the thick fur at the back of his neck, and his strike broke the frame in 2 places, but the effort brought pain that his legs could not ignore, and blood followed his steps like a child who refuses to be left, and his breath grew raw. Mothers made sounds I had never heard, a chord between plea and command, and the young flung themselves where instinct flung them, which is to say toward any space that looked like the size of their bodies, toward gaps that were only shadows pretending to be gaps. I threw myself at the rising wall, dug claws into green wood, felt splinters embed, tore until I could not tell whether the heat on my forepaw was blood or sap, then climbed, and in the instant I cleared the top, the air beside me broke open with manufactured thunder. Light slapped my eyes blind, and heat brushed the entire length of my flank, as if some giant had dragged a hand of flame along me to see what sound I would make. And I made no sound because there wasn't breath to carry it, and I fell back into the world like a stone. The nets came in a practice sequence, the first heavy with metal rings to make obedience, the second layer to correct whatever the first had failed to cover, the third thrown only after the huntmaster had watched where strength still gathered in me, as if he were sewing up a bag around a thing that must not bruise. They had learned our reach and our timing. They had learned the angles our spines could still make after injury. Their craft was not the enthusiasm of amateurs. It was the patience of those who take notes and return to improve their failure. The cords bit deep and deeper where I resisted, and I could feel my own heat now in the net's fibers, a wicked exchange where rage purchased only exhaustion. I lifted my head because pride and love are both stubborn, and I sought the faces beyond the light and smoke. But those were not faces I could use. Those were lamps in a storm. And then I found him, the man whose calm had frightened me more than any weapon, the one who had watched like a surveyor rather than a soldier. He did not need to shout because the others watched him the way rivers watch gravity, and when his hand rose the men on the left edged forward exactly the length of a paw, and when his hand dropped the torches lowered to deprive me of depth. He wore quiet like armor. His gaze met mine without contempt and without compassion, and I felt seen the way a riverbed feels seen when a dam is planned upon it. If there was a moment to bargain, it had passed before I recognized it, because you cannot bargain with the design. You can only yield to it or break it, and I was too rapt to do either. Behind me, to one side, I heard the elder urge two adolescents through a cleft by speaking their names the way you tell a story's ending so the middle will not swamp them, and I wanted to echo him, to put my voice in the night where my body could not go, but the net at my throat had a memory of choking and it used it, and my attempt became only a rasp, and that rasp was a way for the men to know exactly how firm to pull. We say among ourselves that fear has flavors. There is the metallic taste of ambush. There is the sour of too many days without meat. There is the dry of drought. There is the bitter of disease. What I tasted now was different. It was the clean, almost sweet taste of certainty, the flavor of being singled out by a will that believes it is holy. I understood then that to these men I was not hunger answered or danger removed. I was a piece that completed a pattern they had drawn long before their feet stepped into our valley, and patterns make people gentle as they do violence, because a pattern feels like a prayer. The smoke thickened with intent, trained low so it crawled beneath the nets and entered at nose and mouth, and it carried another intelligence, this one a chemical that told muscles to remember sleep. Through the blur, I tried to find each of my kin again. The mother with a scar like a crescent on her shoulder, the young with one toe white, the brother who had learned to climb too early and therefore poorly but had never fallen far, and I caught them in snatches, a tail, a shoulder, an ear turned in my direction as if he could still hear me, and then the smoke took these too, and soon the only firm things left were stone and net and the man's eyes. He stepped closer not to gloat but to ensure a measurement, and I understood that where other men used trophies he used data, that capturing me would become numbers he would show to other men who would make other nets. He studied my breathing and lifted two fingers, and somewhere behind me a knot tightened by exactly the amount required to make the next breath audible, and that sound was written down by someone who did not need to ask permission to write. I remembered suddenly the way rain sounds when it begins on wide-leafed plants, each drop a solid syllable flung into the quiet before becoming river speech, and I try to hold that sound inside my head, because the mountain has saved more than one of us, simply by reminding us who we are when the world insists otherwise. The elder saw me the way fire sees dry grass. He saw the quick path and he took it. He forced his weight into the place where the wall had bitten. He put his head down as if the ground had told him a secret, and he pushed until the lattice shifted just enough that one more mother and her two could squeeze through a stagger of branches while men repositioned to meet the pressure he created. It is a thing you do when you are old and heavy with story. You give the middle of your body to something so the edges can pass. He bought the seconds with pain and with more blood and with one leg that would not obey him after. And when at last he stepped backward from the wall, he did it with a ritual slowness that made everyone present imagine they had arranged it. The wind, which had been stubborn in its silence, moved at last like a messenger who had been delayed by reasons it could not name. It slid in above the smoke and pressed down where the fire biggest, lowering the flames enough that the stone's own breath could be felt again under my chest, and it brought with it the faintest taste of meltwater and of resin warmed by sun, and of that thin sweetness that exists only where moss drinks shade. The memory of home is not a picture. It is a collection of tastes and temperatures that the body can love even while dying. I learned this then, and have not forgotten. I tell you these things because I need the map to be complete when you look at it later. I need you to see not only the bright flags men plant when they claim, but the small places that still refuse to be owned. The pool beneath the root that remembers the first snowfall each year. The rock that always gathers heat even on a short winter day. The line of scent where a fox taught her young to step on stones, so as to leave less story behind them. Those were still ours as the nets tightened. Those will be ours even after the last of us is made into a symbol for your altar, because the mountain belongs to the mountain regardless of your plans upon its skin. The men moved in choreographies that spoke of practice, and the more I watched, the more I understood how far from hunger this was. One caught the corner of a net not to secure me, but to preserve the fabric from tearing. One adjusted the angle of a torch not to frighten, but to perfect a shadow where a colleague needed depth. One shouted a word that had the sound of numbers in it, and 3 others paused for the exact span of the word before resuming their tasks. This was not the logic of tooth, it was the logic of ledger. I became ledger. To say that a body breaks is too simple. What breaks first is the permission you give yourself to behave as if the world is fair. After that, the ribs will do what ribs do, the skin will say what skin says, the breath will find places that are not lungs and try to become useful there. And in the end, you will still be yourself if there is any self left to be, or you will be the thing they planned for you if your name loosens its hold. I kept my name between my teeth. I do not mean I spoke it into the night. I mean I hid it behind the place where the jaw meets the skull, where pressure becomes power, and I would not let it drop even when the chords ask politely, and then less politely for it to be surrendered. The witch wants to tell you, there is a moment, almost invisible, when you cross from honoring life to inventorying it, from meeting a gaze to measuring it, from asking, who are you, to asking, what can you do for me? And in that moment, chains are forged with soft materials. Habit, custom, convenience, fear named as prudence, prayer used as leverage. If you have ever lifted a charm to your chest and whispered not, may I be worthy, but may others bend, you have tasted that forging. If you have ever called a caged spirit protection because it soothed your hunger quicker than your own courage could, you have polished those links yourself. Protection that requires someone else to kneel is not a shield. It is a mirror asking you to admire your chains. Ask yourself, now, with the smoke still in your throat from this telling, when you look upon the unseen, do you look for kinship or for currency, for presence or for performance, for a name or for a use? The answer you give in the quiet will decide whether you walk into the next dawn carrying a lantern or carrying a lease. Part 3. The forest became distance. I had lived my life as one strand in its woven body, each step an echo that the soil welcomed, each breath another syllable in its endless hymn. Now I was carried across it not as kin, but as cargo. The net bound me into shapes no creature should wear, cords biting deeper each time I strained. My paws dragged across ground I had once chosen freely, claws leaving marks like broken signatures. Above me the canopy blurred into a ceiling of firelit motion, shadows of branches crossing like bars in a cage. They hauled me through paths carved by their own hands, straight lines where the forest had always curved, flattened places where roots had been severed. I smelled the absence of what had been taken, the hollow where a tree had stood for centuries, the silence where water no longer trickled because its course had been diverted to feed their machines. Each absence shouted louder than presence, telling me that the mountain was being rewritten into their scripture. The younger hunters shouted and laughed, their voices sharp, brittle with triumph. They struck the net with poles when I resisted, not to kill but to humiliate, to remind me that my struggle had been measured and accounted for. The elder among them did not join their noise. He walked in silence, occasionally touching the chords, adjusting tension as one might tune an instrument. And always there was him, the calm one. He did not strike, he did not shout. He only watched, and when the path bent, he walked ahead of me, as if to show me that I followed willingly. We passed places that had once been mine, the clearing where I had wrestled with kin, now trampled into a field of ash, the riverbank where mothers taught their young to drink, now scarred with boot prints and broken reeds, the ridge from which the stars once unfurled like banners, now drowned in smoke. I wanted to close my eyes, but even that small refusal was denied me. The cords forced my head forward, as if shame itself were part of their design. As the night deepened, new smells began to gather, smells that did not belong to forest or mountain. Resin thick and pungent, but mixed with oils unknown, the metallic tang of iron sharpened for ritual rather than for use, the faint, sweet rot of blood spilled not in hunt, but in offering. The air grew heavy with chanting, low at first, a murmur rising from below the ridges, until it became a rhythm that made the earth itself uneasy. They brought me to a place I had never known, though it had been waiting. Stone shaped not by river or time, but by hands, stacked into walls that defied the slope of the land. Symbols carved into their surfaces, circles within circles, lines intersecting at angles that bent the eye. Fires burned not with wood alone, but with powders that colored flame, green, blue, unnatural hues that hissed as though each spark had a voice. At the center stood an altar of black stone. Its surface was polished, so that firelight bent upon it like water. I felt its hunger before I touched it, a pull that recognized me not as creature, but as fuel. The hunters tightened the nets and hauled me up the carved steps, their feet rehearsed, their breaths synchronized. Some of them muttered prayers, not to me but through me, as though my presence were already a doorway. The calm man finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the chanting with precision. He named me, not with the sound the wind had once gifted, not with the name my kin had roared across valleys, but with a word that stripped meaning into utility. His tongue declared me a vessel. His tone declared me empty. I thrashed against the cords, one final surge, claws raking stone until sparks leapt. The altar accepted the sparks eagerly, swallowing them into a sheen. The hunters forced me down, pressing weight upon my limbs. Cold seeped from the stone into my chest, numbing, drawing. I felt my heartbeat stumble, as if it were no longer mine to command. The witch wants to tell you, when a life is placed upon an altar not in reverence but in conquest, something more than flesh is wounded. The act of naming a being as vessel is the theft of its history, its kinship, its future. You who light candles and kneel, do you know whose breath you borrow when you ask for blessings? Do you know whether the power you call sacred was once a cry silenced, a name unmade? If your faith begins with another soul's captivity, then ask yourself, are you worshiping the divine or the cage? Part 4, the rending of soul. The altar surface was wrong. Stone should feel solid, dependable, echoing the weight of mountain and time. But this stone drank. It pulled at my chest the instant they pressed me against it, not with the bite of rope or the sear of flame, but with a hunger that seemed older than hunger itself. The moment my ribs touched its sheen, I felt it lean inward, as though the rock itself breathed in, and I was the air it desired. The hunters gathered close. Their voices rose in chords I could not follow, each syllable shaped to grate against bone. The cadence was unnatural, crafted for function rather than meaning, words designed not to tell stories, but to strip them away. Powder hissed as it was flung into flame, turning the fire first green, then blue, then a shade of white so sharp it seemed to cut through my vision. Sparks fell like arrows, embedding themselves in the air, and I realized with horror that the very light was being woven into chains. The calm man, always him, stood at the head of the ritual. His face did not change. It carried no triumph, no cruelty. That made it worse. Cruelty at least acknowledges the existence of another. His eyes reflected only task, a ledger being filled. He placed objects around me with the precision of a craftsman. A bowl of ash, a knife etched with lines that glimmered faintly, a vial of liquid that shimmered as though alive. When his hands moved, the chanting shifted to match, as though his gestures wrote their music. Then came the pull. It began in my chest, where the altar's cold had first seeped. My heartbeat faltered, then quickened, then stumbled as though it had lost its own rhythm. Each thud felt weaker, as if the blood had grown impatient and longed to leave. My lungs spasmed, not with suffocation but with betrayal. Breath fled not outward, but upward, torn towards something beyond air. Pain ignited, not the honest pain of wound or fire, but the tearing of fabric that had always been seamless. My body split in awareness, one half bound by rope and clawing at stone, the other dragged upward in a stream of light that bent against my will. The hunters gasped, their chants sharpening, and I realized they could see it. The soul they sought to cage was visible, my essence shimmering like heat above stone. I tried to roar. I tried to summon kin and wind and mountain, but the sound fractured. It scattered into shards, each piece snatched by the chanting and folded into their rhythm. The hunters mistook my broken cry for obedience. They cheered. Only the calm man did not. He merely observed, his gaze calculating, as if checking a sum. Around me, visions collided. I saw the forest bending away, trees collapsing into darkness. I saw my kin fleeing, their forms dissolving into ash. I saw my own body, eyes glazed, claws twitching, already abandoned, no longer mine. The pull grew stronger. It clawed at my name, that syllable of wind given in youth, that anchor which tethered me to truth. It quivered, fragile, a thread stretched to breaking. And yet, through the cacophony, a whisper stirred. The wind. It threaded through cracks in the stone, through spaces too small for men to measure. It carried scents I knew, pine needles crushed under paw, the musk of soil after rain, the laughter of cubs wrestling in moss. It spoke my name, steady and unwavering, even as the ritual tried to erase it. That whisper became a lifeline. I seized it, clinging though my soul was half torn from me, though pain threatened to scatter me into pieces too small to remember. The calm man raised the knife. Its sigils glowed, not with firelight, but with the dull hunger of the stone itself. He cut downward, not into flesh, but into the space above, where my soul strained against chains of light. The blade parted me, not body but being, and I screamed without sound. A river of myself surged upward, unwilling yet compelled, pouring from the vessel of my body into the waiting mouth of the altar. The hunters roared in triumph. They believed they had captured holiness, but I knew what they had captured was theft. My body lay heavy, abandoned, a husk with eyes still open. My spirit trembled in the stone's grip, half inside, half out, torn between memory and void. The altar sang with satisfaction, its surface glowing faintly with the force it swallowed. The chanting reached its climax, words hammering down like blows, each one trying to flatten the last syllable of my name. For one terrible moment, I almost let go, almost surrendered the name, almost allowed myself to be hollow. But the wind returned, fierce now, rushing through the chamber, scattering ash and sparks. It whispered again, not just my name, but the truth beneath it. You are not theirs. You are not vessel. You are not thing. The whisper pierced the stone's hunger, anchoring me, and though the pull did not cease, I no longer felt erased. I laughed then, a sound jagged, broken, but real. My laughter startled the hunters. Some stumbled, faltering in their chants. They did not understand that even in chains, defiance is still a form of freedom. The witch wants to tell you, There is no holiness in chains. To call captivity sacred is to baptize cruelty with incense and prayer. You who kneel before objects, who whisper wishes into stone, do you ask what silence you exploit? Do you know if the blessing you beg for was once a scream strangled into stillness? Every prayer offered to a bound soul is not worship, but partnership in theft. Remember, light that shines through stolen glass does not illuminate. It blinds. Part 5. The Long Night of Stone.
The ceiling did not arrive like a door slamming. It arrived like a breath held too long by a giant who had never learned to exhale. There was no final blow, no triumphant cry. There was a pressure that gathered and gathered until the world narrowed to a single point, and at that point the altar drank the last of me, and what was left behind in the old shape of sinew, and first ceased to be mine. Silence followed, not the forest's benevolent hush where insects tune the margins of night and rivers speak in their sleep, but a manufactured silence, the kind that erases footsteps and edits out names, the kind that takes sound apart and files it under nothing. I learned the dimensions of my new prison by what it refused to answer. I pushed outward with memory and struck a boundary that had no texture, only intent. I tried to draw breath and discovered breath was now a habit without a function. I reached for the rhythm of a heart and felt instead a slow mineral pulse, the stone's satisfaction moving through me like cold sap. The black vessel around me was not empty. It was crowded with command. Where a cave's dark is a place for seeing differently, this dark was a verdict. You will carry what we place in you, and you will not spill. Time, unmoored from sun and shade, remade itself as a series of touches. A hand lifted the stone, and the world moved. The hand set it down, and the world stopped. Palms spoke a language of heat and salt and oils, some dry with age, some damp with nerves, some trembling with the restless beat of victory not yet won. I learned to recognize the difference between the living weight of a bearer and the ceremonial caution of a priest. Fingers with calluses asked different questions of me than fingers that had only ever held pens. The calm man's touch did not return often, but when it did, it carried the same absence as his gaze, a careful inventory that disturbed nothing except the truth. Sound reached me the way light reaches an eye behind a veil. Chanting pressed through the stone in muffled waves, syllables softened into pressure, prayers reduced to motive. The words themselves no longer mattered. What mattered was the angle of the desire behind them, the tilt toward taking. I could not mistake that tilt. It entered as weight. It accumulated. It asked not who I was, but whether I could be used to move what they wanted moved. They taught the stone to answer, and, in so doing, tried to teach me to forget. The ritual did not end with the ceiling. It extended into a series of instructions delivered through smoke and oil and breath. Bring the flame close, and the stone should warm with willingness. Draw a circle in ash upon the surface, and the spirit within should lean toward attention. Name the vessel with a marketable name, never the one the wind gave, and register it on paper whose lines turn lives into columns. They called this consecration. To me it tasted like calibration. The first uses were small, almost tender in their cruelty, the way a hand might test a leash by a gentle tug that nonetheless declares ownership. A coin pressed to the stone, a whisper traded for return, a promise of thanks stitched to the next harvest's hope. I felt the tug and the measure, the invisible line that ran from the ask to my bound silence. Not yet a command to wound, not yet an instruction to break what lay beyond their reach. Those would come later, but a mapping of the ways in which I could be made to pull their world in their preferred direction. Sometimes they left me in a chamber, without windows where the air wore incense like a heavy coat. Footsteps circled as if I were a fire, and they were learning its heat, and every so often a brush of cloth or a soft exhale told me that a new watcher had replaced the old one. When they spoke among themselves, their voices slanted downward, unwilling to let their words climb to where another might seize them. I learned the cadence of secrecy. I learned the stutter of doubt. I learned the intimate sound of faith turning itself into a plan. The mountain did not abandon me entirely. The wind, patient conspirator, found me in the seams they could not imagine mattered. when a door opened and two conversations tried to pass each other in a narrow hall. The wind slipped through on the argument's draft and rested against the stone for the length of a heartbeat. When a bearer stepped from shade into sun and the air curled its fingers around the sudden heat, the wind kept that heat and pressed it into the stone so that I might know day from night by warmth alone. When rain tugged at a roof and one gutter failed, the wind licked the spray into a scent I recognized: wet leaves, metal, the faint sweetness of dust returning to mud, and for a moment the stone's inventory lost its hold, and I remembered what moss says when it drinks. In those intervals, I worked. If I could not break the vessel, I could carve within it. I took my name, the syllable given by wind and used by kin, and I pressed it into the interior boundary where only I could feel, not letters but grooves of attention, the stubborn shape of I am. Each time a prayer came that wished to flatten me into function, I ran my awareness along those grooves, the way a tongue might trace a scar, not to reopen it, but to remember it as yours. When the pressure grew and the chants tried to braid themselves into my thinking, I took the mountain's image and made a map inside the dark. Ridge lines for resolve, ravine for sorrow, river for return. If they insisted I be a container, I would not become blank. I would become a landscape no hand could smooth. What I could feel of the world broadened as the stone left the altar and entered circulation. A coarse cloth wrapped me for travel, and through it I learned the jolt of wheels on carved roads, the stubborn rhythm of animal hooves pulling weight in a harness they did not choose. We passed through air that smelled of kitchens and markets, through spaces where metal sang to itself in forges, through alleys where water talked to brick. The stone recorded all of it as pressure and tone, and I learned to translate.
There were places where voices rose together not in prayer, but in bargaining. Numbers tried on different sizes there, sometimes swaggering, sometimes pleading, and each time someone stroked the stone to test whether the price of power had changed. There were rooms that collected grief like rain collects at the edge of a roof. In those rooms, breaths were thin and often counted, and the hands that lifted the stone were careful almost to gentleness, as if not to wake the body on the bed. There were corners where laughter wore the sharp teeth of luck, and when the stone passed through those, its surface tingled with the sweat of men who asked to win at any cost and called that victory a blessing. All this before I was ever placed upon a household altar or hung against a chest to knock lightly against a bone with each step. All this before the regular devotions and the seasonal feasts and the careful explanations to guests about how a particular spirit had become a family's guard. The life of a tool begins in corridors and counting rooms long before it begins in prayers. They would have said the spirit was being presented to the world. I will say the merchandise was being introduced to the market. In the midst of this parade of ownership, there were moments that did not cut. A child, the size of a fresh snowdrift, touched the stone between two fingers as if it might bruise and whispered nothing at all, only breathed with me for the length of a curiosity. A woman with wrists like willow branches wiped the surface clean with a cloth she had washed 3 times in river water, not to purify the object but as if to make room for someone visiting, and when she finished, she rested her palm upon me for a time without adding a wish to the contact, and the stone learned a silence that did not suffocate. A worker whose hands were nicked by knives used for cooking set the stone down among bowls and did not look at it again, because his mother in the other room was sleeping for the first time in 3 nights, because the brief mercy of sleep was all the blessing required. He did not ask me for it, and so I did not have to refuse. I will not lie. There were also touches that ached long after they lifted. The first time someone asked for harm and called it justice, the stone took the shape of that request and tried to pour it through me. I held fast to the grooves of my name and the wind, arriving late as always and perfectly on time, threaded itself among the fibers and bent the request back into the hand that made it as doubt. Doubt is not punishment. It is a mirror. He put the stone away for an hour and then returned to demand again in a louder whisper. Loudness is belief impersonating courage. He received his silence. Nights were the worst, not because of loneliness. I had learned the weights of alone long before men discovered the valley, but because night was when their need unmasked itself. Day carried errands, numbers, faces that had to meet other faces. Night allowed the private bargain to step forward. Voices trembled then with honesty. Some begged for small mercies, a fever to break, a letter to arrive, a debt to be forgiven. Some begged for impossible reroutings of fate. Some did not beg, they commanded. I learned the three flavors of want. The want that reveals love, the want that reveals fear, the want that reveals appetite. The stone held all three equally and did not discern. I had to, and always the ledger waited. Not visible to me, but I felt its presence each time a new hand took possession. Each time a different breath claimed authority to ask. Records were being kept somewhere, the kind that put a number beside a name, the kind that insists counting is the same as knowing. The calm man's craft had reached its preferred state, the bound spirit moving through the economy of need, each transaction polishing the story of power until it gleamed. I discovered a cruel truth in those days. Captivity can be made to look like service if you speak about it in the right light. They said the spirit was generous. They said the stone was strong. They said the prayers were noble. When a request was granted, they called it miracle. When it was denied, they called it mystery. When it was twisted back upon the requester, they pitted the requester's lack of faith. Every explanation protected the premise that no theft had occurred. It is a difficult premise to crack when a name has been erased. I refused the erasure. I kept my name like a coal. If I could not blaze, I could at least hold heat. I reheard the mountain each time a door opened to a different sky, or a gust barged into a room, or a bearer lingered near a window. I rebuilt the ridge line with memory. I stacked stones where resolve needed weight. I dug a pool where grief could sit without drowning everything near it. When a wish came that would harm someone else to feed its own hunger, I leaned my whole interior landscape against it until the wish found no purchase. When a wish came that mistook possession for love, I tugged at its disguise until the asker saw their own reflection and chose otherwise. Not always, not perfectly. I am not a god. I am a soul in a stone, and even that, they will tell you, is too much. The witch wants to tell you. Ask yourself, when your hands reach for power that answers quickly, whose breath pays your price? If the object before you is smooth with the use of many, if its story begins with capture and continues with compliance, then your prayer, even dressed in the best words you own, leans toward conquest. Faith that requires a cage is not faith. It is an arrangement. An arrangement may comfort you. It may even change your luck for a while. But luck is not light, and comfort that silences another's name is a comfort that will one day demand your own. If you must ask for courage to do what kindness requires. Ask for the strength to return what was taken. Ask for the sight that recognizes a soul even when others have wrapped it in ritual and price. And when you meet the unseen, do not ask first what it can do for you. Ask who it is. Then decide whether your hands are meant to hold or meant to let go. Part 6. The Weight of Prayers. Captivity did not end with sealing. Sealing was only the first bruise. What followed was use. At first, it came as whispers. Hands lifted the stone carefully, breath damp against its surface. They asked for simple things, health for a child, a safe return from a journey, the easing of pain in aging bones. Their words carried tremors of fear, and when their voices broke, I felt the sincerity beneath them. The weight pressed on me, pulling at my spirit. The altar inside the stone shifted, demanding that I answer. A part of me wanted to. Memory of kin and cubs stirred. The instinct to protect was not yet gone. When a mother begged for her child's fever to break, I released the smallest current of warmth, letting the wind slip through her window at night, cooling the child's skin. She wept in gratitude, never knowing her thanks fell on chains. But mercy invited expectation. Once a single prayer received an answer, more followed. Not from her alone, but from others who had heard. The stone passed from hand to hand, carried into homes that smelled of incense and smoke, into markets where voices traded not only goods but hope. Each new prayer tugged at me like claws, and each tug left behind a thread torn loose. Requests grew heavier. A man pressed his forehead to me, begging not for health but for profit, that his rivals' crops might fail so his own fields would be prized. Another whispered with a lover's voice, asking that a woman abandon her vows, that affection be twisted into possession. A soldier laid me against his chest and demanded survival in battle, not only for himself, but for the death of his enemy. Each prayer entered me, a cord thrown into my silence, and each pulled something away. The pain was not physical, it was erosion. Every time they asked, a part of me frayed. It felt like fibers of light peeling off, leaving me thinner, more translucent. The hunters had bound me, but the worshippers consumed me. I began to understand that captivity is not only a chain, it is an appetite that feeds endlessly. Nights were the worst. By day, prayers were mixed with noise, diluted by market cries, by the rhythm of labor, by the chatter of families. At night, voices lowered, masks fell. Alone in dark rooms, they whispered what they dared not speak in daylight. Let him suffer. Make her mine. Take away what belongs to them and give it to me. Their words dripped into the stone, thick and corrosive. I bore them all, unable to block their entry. My resistance was silence, but silence itself became agreement in their eyes. Some prayers twisted deeper. There were those who bled upon the stone, believing sacrifice would force obedience. The copper tang seeped in, demanding exchange. Others struck bargains, promising offerings if their desires were met. Coins, livestock, flesh. Their greed was louder than their faith. And yet, among the shadows, a few still touched me differently. Children again, curious and unburdened. They held me with small hands, eyes wide with wonder, not asking, only listening. Their silence soothed me, a rare pause in the torrent. Once, a girl pressed me to her chest and whispered, "Are you lonely?" She received no answer, but her question left an echo. I learned to measure the world by the weight of their prayers. The light ones bent me, but did not break me. The heavy ones tore pieces away. The cruel ones cut like knives, leaving scars that glowed inside the dark. And each time I resisted, each time I refused to twist the wind toward harm, I heard the same refrain outside. The spirit is weak. The vessel has lost power. They did not know that weakness was not failure, but defiance, that their darkness could not compel me to become it. Still, the cost was real. I grew thinner. My name, though still carved deep within, flickered when too many hands pressed at once. The wind came less often, blocked by walls and doors, and without it the silence thickened into suffocation. The witch wants to tell you, when you pray, do you ask for life to be nurtured, or do you demand that it bend? When you hold an object and whisper into it, do you remember that silence does not mean consent? Every answered prayer carries a cost you may never see, but someone pays it. If the blessings you receive are born of another's captivity, then what you call faith is only consumption. Remember this, a true blessing is shared light, not stolen fire. If your desire dims another soul, then what you grasp is not protection but shadow. Part 7. The silence that defies. The weight of prayers did not cease. It multiplied. Every day brought more hands, more whispers, more offerings dropped onto the stone, as if I were a well that could never run dry. Coins clinked, blood dripped, incense curled upward like a leash of smoke. But I no longer strained to answer. The fibers of my soul had grown too thin to be wasted on every whim, and somewhere in that thinning, I discovered clarity. The clarity was bitter, sharp, but it steadied me. I began to laugh, not with sound, for the stone devoured sound, but with a vibration that shook only within. My laughter was jagged, broken, but it was mine, and it was stronger than any chain they laid across me. For the first time since the sealing, I felt control, not over the world outside, but over my refusal. So when a man pressed his lips to the stone and begged for his neighbor's ruin, I gave him nothing. When a woman asked for the breaking of vows so she could steal another's love, I remained still. When soldiers carried me into battlefields, demanding survival bought with others' deaths, I turned silent, letting their cries rise unanswered into the smoke. Each time I withheld, their faces twisted with confusion, then frustration, then scorn. They said the spirit was weakening. They said the vessel had lost power. They said more offerings were required. And still I laughed within, because weakness was not what they saw. It was resistance. They could measure the strength of chains. They could weigh the worth of gold. But they could not measure refusal, and they could not weigh silence that was chosen. My silence was my rebellion. My silence was my survival. In markets, I felt the indignity of barter. I was passed from one set of hands to another, inspected like livestock, my surface polished to hide the truth that a soul screamed within. Men haggled over me as though I were nothing more than carved wood, their voices rising, their palms sweating. They spoke of my strength as if it were inventory. They argued about my age as if it determined value, and all the while I lay still, refusing them even the courtesy of recognition. At night altars, my body of stone sat among bowls of fruit and sticks of incense, surrounded by muttering mouths. They spoke of miracles, of curses reversed, of dreams delivered. They blamed me when harvests failed, praised me when luck returned, cursed me when their desires went unmet. They never saw that the true measure of blessing was already inside their choices, not inside my chains. The worst were not the greedy. Greed is at least honest. The worst were the devout, the ones who believed their cruelty sanctified by prayer. They knelt, they wept, they offered sacrifice, and then they asked for destruction. They asked for rivals to fall, for enemies to die, for lovers to be bound against their will. They spoke these wishes as if they were hymns, coating their darkness in incense smoke. To them, I was not a captive soul. I was an accomplice. I rejected them all. My laughter grew colder. It was not joy, but armor. If they mistook it for silence, so be it. If they called me weak, so be it. Better to be weak in their eyes than to be complicit in their hunger. And slowly I understood. The stone was not my true prison. Their desires were. The chains were not carved in ritual. They were woven in hearts that had forgotten reverence, hearts that saw only utility. As long as people believed power could be bought through suffering, there would always be altars, always be stones, always be cages waiting for souls. The witch wants to tell you, when you kneel and whisper, are you offering love or are you demanding conquest? Do you call your cruelty holy because you light a candle beside it? Faith that builds itself upon another's pain is not faith at all. It is hunger pretending to be prayer. If your silence after asking feels heavy, perhaps it is not because the divine ignores you. Perhaps it is because the divine refuses to become your weapon. Remember this. Refusal is also a form of truth. And sometimes, silence is the only way a soul can still say no. Part 8. The Fortress of Silence. Silence became my companion, but not the silence of surrender. It was a fortress, built brick by brick inside me, each unanswered prayer a wall, each refusal a locked gate. From within this citadel, I began to watch, not with the desperation of a prisoner pressing at bars, not with the hope of escape, but with the clarity of one who has accepted the dark and now studies every shape inside it. Hands still lifted me, lips still pressed my surface. Smoke curled upward from incense, sweet and choking, filling narrow rooms with haze. But from inside the stone, I no longer felt only the weight of demand. I began to discern the texture of the souls who carried those demands. A farmer prayed for rain, his voice quivering with fear of famine. His desperation was sharp, but beneath it I heard not reverence, only terror. A merchant begged that his rival's goods spoil in storage. His words were coded in ritual, but they stank of envy. A soldier before battle promised offerings of blood if I would ensure victory. His tone carried not devotion, but the hunger to survive even at the cost of others' lives. One by one they revealed themselves. Their prayers were not hymns. They were confessions disguised as worship. And I, bound and silent, became the witness to their shadows. Markets were worse. I was placed on tables, my surface polished, buyers arguing over my supposed strength. They haggled as if trading cattle, assigning value not by spirit but by rumor. This one grants fortune, one would say. This one curses enemies, claimed another. My silence was their proof, my captivity their advertisement. They dressed my suffering as blessing, and men counted coins while calling it faith. At night altars, I felt the litany of selfishness pour like tar. Men demanded triumph over rivals. Women demanded lovers betray their vows. Families begged for wealth, not sustenance, but dominance. Their candles flickered like eyes unwilling to see. When their wishes went unanswered, they called me weak. When their desires failed, they brought more offerings, certain that enough blood or gold could force obedience. And yet, not all was wrought. Children still came. Their small hands trembled as they touched me, not to command, but to wonder. They whispered questions no adult would ask. Do you dream? Are you lonely? They received no answer, but their innocence echoed inside me longer than any chant. Once, a girl held me close and said, I don't want anything. I just want you to rest. That touch was softer than wind, and for a moment, my silence warmed. There were others too. A widow placed me by her bed, not to demand miracles, but to keep company with her grief. She never prayed aloud, only sat in quiet, and in that quiet I felt companionship rather than theft. A laborer, hands cracked and bleeding, placed me among his tools and whispered no request, only sighed, as though acknowledging that exhaustion itself needed no divine cure. These rare moments were the fragments of light in my darkness, reminders that not all who touched me had forgotten what reverence meant. So I endured. I made my silence into a blade, slicing through the lies wrapped around their prayers. I refused not out of weakness, but out of strength. If they called me powerless, so be it. Better powerless in their eyes than corrupted by their demands. My laughter, cold and voiceless, grew sharper with each unanswered plea. And in that laughter I discovered truth. The stone was not my prison. Their hunger was. They lived in cages of their own making, built from greed, envy, fear. I was sealed in stone, but they were sealed in desire. The difference was that I knew my chains. They did not. The witch wants to tell you, faith is not the art of bending the world to your will. Faith is the courage to see yourself without disguise. When you kneel and whisper, do you ask for light, or do you demand shadow to cover your shame? When you place offerings before a captive soul, do you believe you are worshiping, or are you simply feeding your hunger with another's silence? Remember this, a blessing that wounds another is not a blessing, but a theft. A prayer that cages a voice is not devotion, but complicity. If you seek the unseen, let it teach you this. True faith does not ask for chains. True faith is the freedom you grant, even when it costs you your desire. Part 9. The Edge of Diminishing Light. There is a season of captivity when the vessel feels more ghost than stone, when the pressure of asking becomes a weather system that never breaks, when even refusal seems a luxury too costly to spend. I reached that season. The grooves of my name, carved stubbornly along the inner boundary where only I could feel, thinned at the edges the way paths thin when grass reclaims what hoof once taught. The wind, faithful conspirator, still found me, but its visits were less frequent, its messages pruned to the shortest truths. Hold, breathe, remember. Sometimes those three were the same act. The prayers changed first, then multiplied. They arrived without pretense, stripped of the polite cloth that earlier years had draped across greed. A magistrate pressed his brow to my surface in a chamber that smelled of wax and old wood. He asked that a rival be exposed in scandal, not for justice, but to clear a path for his own ambition. A wealthy man bought me at auction, and immediately demanded that those who had laughed at him in youth lose their positions, their respect, the walls of their reputations brought down brick by brick. He described this as balance restored and called the cruelty maturity. A woman who had learned the secret arithmetic of rumor asked me to place a sickness in the house of a neighbor whose child was praised too often. She framed it as fairness because her own child had not been praised enough. The night before a campaign, a commander cradled me like a relic, promising temples and offerings and 1,000 kneelings if I would claim the wind for his banners and the silence for his enemies' voices. Every vow was a mouth with teeth. The stone conducted all of it with ruthless efficiency, not because it was evil, but because it had been taught to carry anything poured into it. The more they used me to justify their hungers, the more those hungers learned to arrive dressed as destiny. Their words slid over my surface like oil poured into water and then forced downward by a spoon. The pressure did the work. I felt the familiar tug at the center where ritual had once pried the soul wide. Threads loosened, brightness sloughed off in quiet husks. What remained of me gathered in the lowest places and tried to make itself smaller than a wanting could grasp. I learned the texture of near collapse. It is not a loud event. It is the slow removal of scaffolds, the gradual unlearning of distance between self and task, the moment when the thought to resist arrives late and finds there is nothing left to stand on. I knew I was approaching that edge when the names of my kin, once stacked like stones along the path of memory, began to slide in rain. When I reached for the ridge line I had raised within, and my fingers found a gentle slope where there had been a spine. When I listened for the elders breathed the way a grove listens for its tallest tree and heard only the small negotiations of leaves with shade. The calm man returned then, because men like him return when measures drift and lines refuse to hold. He came without announcement, without the theater of incense and procession, and he carried instruments that did not gleam but spoke of adjustments, of minute corrections, of turning screws in places no eye without training would see. He set me upon a table where the light was honest and unflattering. He did not pray.
He observed.
The air around his work smelled of dust and tea and iron. He tapped the stone in 5 places and listened to what returned, then drew a shape upon paper that looked to me like a map of gates. He spoke to an assistant in numbers and angles and finally in words that have no equivalent in the forest, words that mean take more and make it smoother. Beneath his hands, a ritual without candles unfolded. He pressed against the boundary I had carved, the very grooves of I am, not with malice, but with the boredom of a mechanic. Where my refusal had become muscle, he sought fatigue. Where my silence had thickened into bark, he looked for rock. He found some. He tried to widen it with patience. When he failed to break through, he did not rage. He added a note to his ledger about tolerances and time. The worst harm is often delivered by those who do not hate you at all, only need you to behave. I held because the wind chose that hour to arrive, not in triumph, not in storm, but in the small customaries that make rooms inhabitable. A door opened and 2 uncertainties collided in the corridor, and their collision made a draft. A window long painted shut loosened when a caretaker finally grew tired of the way it wheezed. The assistant sighed in a key that reminded the air how to travel. The wind used all of these like rope. It found me and laid its cool hand upon the map inside, following the river I had sketched with memory, tracing the ridge with its fingertip as if to say this line is still a line. The calm man frowned, not because he felt the wind, but because his measurement changed without permission. He tapped the stone again and wrote a smaller number beside the earlier one, the change almost an offense to his neatness. After he left, the darkest prayers began in earnest. The market had learned to speak in my direction. The circles where my presence was a password grew larger. There are neighborhoods in every city where the night makes a list of expenses and men volunteer which conscience they can spare to pay them. I was placed upon tables sticky with spilled drink and surrounded by laughter that had learned to wear knives. Hands that smelled of gun oil, and ink took turns describing the world they preferred. A boy who called himself a man asked me to make a debt collector disappear because the collector had a wife who smiled too carefully at apartments he could not afford. A woman who collected altars the way others collect scarves asked for a way to bind a younger lover to her house, her bed, her name. She promised me a ring and mispronounced gratitude as she pressed it to the stone. I answered none of it. Not refusal as spectacle, not refusal as lesson, simply the refusal that protects the remnant of self from being repurposed into weapon. My silence thickened. It learned to occupy the stone the way water learns the cup it lives in. It offered no edge a wish could grip. People called me dormant or fickle or expensive. They passed me along and spoke of the times when I had been more generous. Generosity, the way they meant it, had always been theft. They had only learned to enjoy the distribution. But desolation is not a straight path, and even in the alley where prayers come sharpened, moments occur that the planners did not schedule. A child wandered into the back room where a purchase was being argued and placed a cup of water beside me because the child's mother had taught the child that all guests should be offered water. The child did not address me. The child did not know I had a name separate from the one the adults used to dignify their appetites. That cup cooled the stone a fraction, the way cloud cover cools a meadow, and in that fraction, I found enough shade to write my name again where it had thinned. Another night, a janitor paused in the door of a shrine after polishing the floor, rested one hand against my surface, and said nothing at all. I felt the weariness in his bones, the way he asked no thing to do his work for him, and still stood for a breath to share the room with what he did not understand. If the wind could bow, it bowed then. When I could do no more than survive, a final test came disguised as ceremony. The calm man had sold the method of my making to a patron with a hunger for prestige. A public ritual was arranged, not in the shadows where chains are easily hidden, but in a hall with pillars and witnesses and a choreography for all. I was placed upon an altar of new marble and surrounded by people dressed to look like reverends. The patron announced that the time had come to prove what the old ways refused to perfect. He spoke a sentence about mercy and a paragraph about control. The room applauded. The wind was not invited. He offered his examples: a rival who had questioned his accounting, a journalist who had asked where the money for such rituals was found, a lover who had grown less amazed. He said their names in a voice that pretended sorrow. He invited the crowd to watch as prayer accomplished what courts could not and conversation would not. He lifted me like a trophy slowly enough for all to see the way light found me and called that light sanctity. The first request struck like a hammer, not because it had more power than the requests in the back rooms and the bedrooms, but because it had been trained to be proud. It demanded not only that someone else be diminished, but that the diminishing be elegant, undeniable, permanent. The second followed, braided through with laws and the theater of truth. The third was merely bored and asked me to make boredom interesting by breaking a life. I do not know what silence looks like to those who are sure their words are engines. To me, in that hall, it looked like a plain. I imagined a stretch of land without monument where the wind had room to rehearse the mile it would run tomorrow. I spread myself across it as evenly as I could, the way a snow cover spreads to protect what it hides from freeze and teeth. The demands that hit me slid. The crowd leaned forward to see the impact and saw none. The patron raised his hands to gather focus, and discovered focus requires gravity. Somewhere behind the pillars a door failed to latch, and the night outside, tired of being told it could not attend, walked in with the smallest creak. That was the moment the wind returned with more than message. It arrived as the ordinary world asserting its right to continue. It ran a quick hand along the instruments on the ritual table so that two chimed out of order. It lifted the hem of a robe so that a dignitary's heel hesitated and the sentence in his mouth misplaced its important word. It found the journalist's lungs and reminded them how to fill completely so that the next question came on a column of air that could not be pressed flat by custom. It went to the lover and loosened the story that had been binding her to her own silence. It did not break the hull. It rearranged it so that truth found its missing chair. I laughed then, not to mock but to survive. Laughter, when it is quiet enough to be mistaken for breath, strengthens the ribs. The patron heard nothing and grew angry at the absence of obedience. He turned to the calm man for correction and found not remedy, but a page that said the measurements were within expected tolerances. That is the trouble with cages refined to efficiency. When they fail to do the impossible, there is no language available to report the failure. The ritual ended as rituals end, with a benediction that tried to retroactively convert disappointment into mystery. People left by the doors in which their stations required they appear. The hall remembered how to be a building. I was returned to a smaller altar, one that had learned the patience of dust. The wind, having finished its errands, leaned against me with the satisfaction of a craftsperson putting down tools at dusk. It did not say I had won. It said I was still here, and there is a difference. I pressed my name into the boundary again, not carving now but retracing, the way a traveler traces a map to keep the distance honest. After that night, the darkest prayers did not stop. People who had witnessed failure concluded that more fuel would be needed. There were new offerings, new bargains, new threats disguised as covenants. I did not change my answer. A refusal repeated becomes a language no bribe can translate. The cost of speaking it remains, and the erosion continues, and some days the plane of silence looks narrow enough that a single hoof could pierce it. On those days the wind comes in smaller forms, a draft under a door, a child's hum tune from a staircase, a window's stubborn generosity in a room where two people are trying not to say goodbye. Small is not the opposite of strong. Small is the opposite of gone. The witch wants to tell you, the edge you stand on when you ask for power over another is thinner than you believe. You tell yourself it is protection, you name it necessity, you dress it in candles so you may look at it without flinching, but it remains a hunger that requires someone else to become less. And every time you feed it, you teach your hands to forget how to open. You teach your mouth to confuse prayer with appetite. You teach your heart to call a cage a sanctuary. If you must kneel, kneel to face what your wanting would cost another. If you must ask for the strength to bear the parts of your life you would rather outsource to a captive soul. And when silence meets you where you expected thunder, do not call it failure. Consider that it might be mercy, someone else's last light refusing to go out in order to keep you from mistaking darkness for your birthright. Part 10. The echo of refusal. In the end, there was no end. Chains do not shatter with the sound of thunder. They fray in silence, strand by strand, until one day they are thin enough that even a whisper can pass through. That was how I learned to remain, not in triumph, but in persistence. I did not escape the stone, but I did not vanish within it either. I existed in the narrow space between erasure and endurance, and in that narrowness I discovered my last weapon, the refusal to become what they wanted. The prayers continued. They always would. Greed never sleeps. Envy never dies. Fear never tires. Each new voice pressed upon me, demanding, bargaining, commanding. But my silence had grown vast, a plain without horizon. Their words landed upon it and found no echo. Some called me dead. Others called me dormant. A few called me patient. None of them understood that my refusal was a kind of roar, one that did not need sound to shake foundations. And still, the wind came. It found cracks no man could see, slipped through doors left ajar, brushed past robes and ledgers. It came in laughter that was honest, in the sigh of someone too tired to pretend, in the breath of children who touched me without demand. Each time it arrived, it carried something outward, a fragment of my defiance, a trace of my cold laughter, the unbroken syllable of my name. The wind became my messenger, scattering pieces of me into the world, so that somewhere, someone might hear and remember that not all silence is consent. I laughed one final time, not for myself, but for them, for the hunters who thought they had mastered me, for the worshippers who mistook their appetites for faith, for the calm man who reduced lives to numbers. My laughter was not victory. It was a reminder that even in chains, a soul can still say no. And now, I turn the question to you. When you whisper your prayers, what do they reveal of you? Do they speak of love or of hunger? Do they honor freedom or do they bargain for chains? When you ask for blessing, do you know whose silence you are pressing your words against? The witch wants to tell you, not every voice is meant to answer. Sometimes silence is the only mercy left. If you listen closely, you may discover that the silence you hear is not absence, but refusal, a refusal that protects what little light remains from being consumed. True faith does not demand the unseen to bend. True faith bends you, reshaping your hands so they open instead of clench, reshaping your heart so it gives instead of hoards. And if you truly seek the unseen, seek it not in stones or cages, but in the freedom you allow others to keep. Crescent Moon closing. If this story has touched you, please help us by subscribing, liking, saving, and sharing it, so that more voices, even those long silenced, may be heard again. Your support ensures that the unseen will not remain unseen forever.